Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to dive into our new unit and talk about the events leading up to the spectacularly bloody Great War. Obviously, the path to war is a little bit of a winding one here, so we're going to go through the basic events that led to the beginning of World War One, and then talk about the early strategy in the war and how this sort of shaped the conflict going forward. So, here's our objectives. Let's dive in and try to untangle this massively tangled web. So, things that led to World War One. Part of it is the alliance system. Going all the way back to the late Napoleonic era and the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, European countries had tried to create what's called a balance of power. Originally, this was designed to surround France in case they went all French Revolution and supernova on everyone again. But over time, conservative politicians tried to create a balanced series of alliances in order to make sure that no one was really incentivized to go to war against anyone else. The Germans specifically had always tried to appease the Russians and had hoped to keep the Russians on their side because for the Germans, especially for Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, they were incredibly concerned that if Russia went into an alliance with France and England, that Germany would be caught in a sort of a two-front war situation in case of a great power war in Europe, and would really struggle to be able to fight back against two great powers. Unfortunately for Germany, the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, is going to decide that he's smarter than Otto von Bismarck, and he's going to he's going to kick Otto von Bismarck out of office, and is going to alienate Russia and push them right into the arms of France and Britain. Russia desperately needed money for their modernization projects, especially railroads, and so their alliance with French bankers brought Russia into what's called the Triple Entente. And Germany then is forced into alliance with Austria-Hungary, which they had already been allied with, and then they brought Italy in as this newly independent country in order to form what's known as the Triple Alliance. So these are the basic battle lines at the beginning of World War One. On the one hand, you've got Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other hand, you have England, France, and Russia. One of the other concerns was the rise of European colonies and the fact that Germany and Italy, as newly independent countries, were relatively new to this whole imperial game. So pause and read the speech here. This lays out both tensions between imperialism and militarism. The naval arms race is one that was really starting to stretch a lot of countries at this time. Especially the building of battleships was seen as absolutely essential because, as we learned in a whole bunch of different conflicts, both the first Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War and the Spanish-American War, if you don't have a modern battleship fleet, you're going to be totally obliterated. And so as each country invested in newer and more powerful battleships, your dreadnoughts, your super dreadnoughts, stuff like that, other countries had to keep pace or else they would fall behind. This was the same with military spending and technology. No one wanted to be left behind in case of a great power war, which everyone sort of thought was coming. And so we're going to see here military budgets expand over time in a really unsustainable path. So if there isn't some conflict at some point, military budgets are going to grow out of control, and they're really going to eat up a lot of the profits of these countries, preventing them from providing basic social services and other sort of governmental functions. We're also going to see tension in the Balkans. Nationalism had led to a series of wars in the Balkans. The whole Russo-Turkish War was the first phase of trying to create this homeland for the Slavic peoples. You'd had a number of other Balkan territories, and all of this was taking territory away from the Ottoman Empire to create some type of Slavic homeland. And this was very important for the Russians because they started to see themselves as the defender of Slavic peoples and the sort of defender of Orthodox Christianity. And so they're looking to encroach on the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the goal for the Russians is always the taking of the great city of Constantinople, which was the original sort of citadel of Orthodox Christianity. So this is another source of tension here. In the end, the spark was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. In the settlement of the Balkan War, many Serbian nationalists were upset that there wasn't a larger Serbia created. Serbia was seen as sort of the driver of Slavic independence movements, the same way Piedmont Sardinia was in Italy. And the hope was that Serbia would be able to take significantly more territory from Austria-Hungary. When the aftermath of the Balkans Wars did not make that happen, Serbian terrorists started targeting Austro-Hungarian leaders, and specifically the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, who was the Archduke and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a guy named Gavrilo Princeps, who was, again, a Serbian nationalist and terrorist. This assassination created a huge diplomatic problem and started the ball rolling towards World War I, because World War I was going to be a massive imperial war. It would require substantial challenges as far as modernization goes. You needed millions of shells. You needed your battleships ready to go. You need millions of men under arms and ready to go fight. And if other countries started mobilizing before you started mobilizing, you might not be ready when war came. And so once one country started preparing for war, it really meant that all other countries started preparing for war. It started a countdown and a race to prepare. So once one nation starts this ball rolling, all the other nations are going to also have to prepare for war. And then, of course, because you can't be perpetually mobilized, this means the war has to start soon, lest you're paying millions of men to sit around and do nothing. So this mobilization challenge is going to be really important going forward. Austria is going to demand that Serbia allows them unlimited access to their territory in order to investigate and bring to justice these Serbian terrorists. Serbia is going to refuse to do that. Austria is then going to threaten Serbia, and Serbia is going to then reach out to Russia, who is their defender, in order to provide them with backing. And so Austria threatens Serbia, Serbia calls in aid from Russia, and now we've got a sort of pseudo showdown between Austria and Russia. Here's the ultimatum. The Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy is going to demand an answer, which Serbia is not going to give, which is going to lead to increasing threats. Germany is going to pledge to universally support Austria-Hungary in case of war, which is going to give the Austro-Hungarians increasing boldness to demand more things from Serbia. The Germans hoped this would diffuse the conflict, but instead it threw more fuel on the fire, because Franz Joseph here is going to now believe that he has full German backing to more or less do whatever he wants. The Russians, worried about the Germans mobilizing and attacking before them, begin the process of mobilization. Nicholas II was incredibly worried about facing this German war machine while he was unprepared, and so he's going to start mobilizing his massive forces. Russia is an incredibly big country and also not particularly industrially advanced. And so this means they're going to need a longer time to mobilize than anyone else. So Russia is going to begin mobilizing, which all of a sudden starts that countdown. And now Germany is going to have to start mobilizing, or else Russia is going to be prepared for war before them. This was even more complicated. So here we've got Russian mobilization. So take a moment, pause and read, and we'll move forward. This leads Germany to declare war on Russia and also to prepare for war with France, because if Russia goes to war, the triple entente is going to establish that France will also go to war with them. And so who's responsible for this? Is it France for signing the treaty? Is it Germany for giving the blank check? Is it Serbia for not giving in to Austria? Is it Austria for threatening Serbia? Is it Russia for mobilizing first? Honestly, who's responsible for this? Probably all of them. Germany is incredibly worried, as we talked about before, about having to fight a two-front war. And so the way that the war develops is really dependent on Germany's war plan, because indefinitely fighting a two-front war is not workable. You have to divide your forces and provide double the effort that either France or Russia would have to have. And so Germany understood that they could not perpetually fight a two-front war in World War I. And so they came up with this Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was to attempt to knock out France first. The understanding was that Russia, of course, we learned from the Napoleonic Wars, very difficult to knock out of a war, especially if they use scorched earth tactics. So the Germans were going to take this massive sledgehammer and crush the French first. Like they did in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans were pretty confident that they could do this. They could knock out the French and then turn to face the Russians. They were hopeful they could keep the British out of it and keep it an isolated war between England and France, but The French had mobilized significant defenses along their border with Germany in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War for obvious reasons. And so the Germans, in order to avoid those defenses, are going to move through neutral Belgium. The Schlieffen Plan demanded German troops mobilize and move through Belgium, the Germans hoped that the Belgians would just sort of tacitly allow them to move through, or possibly even aid them by providing them access to railroads and things like that. Once their troops moved through Belgium, they'd be able to attack France, knock them out of the war quickly, and then turn their focus to Russia. Here's the description of the German army moving through Brussels. This gives us this gives us an image of the sort of industrial quality and scope of the war. So take a moment, pause, and read this, and then we'll move forward. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Belgians do not acquiesce to their desires. The Belgians begin to fight back. They start attacking German troops. They start blowing up bridges, things like that. And so the Germans fight back, defeat the Belgians, and then start executing and committing reprisals against Belgian troops, which leads to outrage amongst the rest of the Europeans. Obviously, the Belgians cannot actually stop the Germans, and so the Germans begin to look like this horrible bully, picking on the poor Belgians and killing Belgian civilians after invading Belgian territory. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Treaty of London had established that Belgium should be independent and that England would get involved if Belgian independence was ever threatened. The Germans dismissed this treaty as a, quote, scrap of paper, hoping that the British would not enter into a general war over Belgium, and unfortunately they were wrong, because England is going to jump in, and English and French troops are going to mobilize to try to take on the Germans. The first major battle of the war, and describing battles in World War I is incredibly difficult because they're not battles in the traditional sense. These armies are so large that it's huge, sweeping companies of men crashing into huge, sweeping companies of other men. Each of these battles is actually thousands of little battles and thousands of tiny engagements that, in order to make them even slightly comprehensible, especially in a survey class like this one, we need to oversimplify them. So we're going to oversimplify the Battle of the Frontiers. Massive lines of German troops sweep into massive lines of British and French troops. And what we basically learn is that the French were not prepared for this modern style of war. The French troops going off to World War I were outfitted very much like Napoleon's troops were. Their artillery was relatively light and mobile, whereas the Germans had harder helmets, had much larger artillery. And this much larger artillery is really going to tear apart the French and British units and force them back. And so most of the time when these troops fought, German artillery proved superior with its longer range and massive destructive power, tearing apart French troops before the French artillery could even get into range. This led French and British troops to fall back as quickly as possible in what's called the Great Retreat. The Germans marched day and night to try to catch up with these forces, and in the early phases of World War I, it really looked like the Schlieffen Plan was going to be effective. The German troops invading across the German border held the French troops in place. German troops swung through, crushing French and British troops as they moved closer and closer to Paris. And it seemed as if, again, the Schlieffen Plan was going to be successful. France would be knocked out. Germany could then pivot and hit Russia before Russia would even mobilize, and the war might be over immediately. Unfortunately for the Germans, the French were able to steady themselves, and the French general Joseph Joffre here did not panic. He stoically organized resistance. They specifically organized the citizens and the troops around Paris to be sent out to the front lines, and he left the capital undefended to launch a counterattack into the German lines that were pushing further and further into France. They then, at this Battle of the Marne, stopped the Germans and broke a hole in the German lines, now forcing the Germans to retreat and fall back. And so the Schlieffen Plan has already failed. The Germans have to fall back. They fall back to the River Aisne, where they begin digging trenches. This is the beginning of trench warfare, where European armies began to create fortified lines across almost the entire European continent in order to hide and protect themselves from these modern weapons of war, from machine guns, from shelling, from these modern sort of destructive implements. These trenches became incredibly effective and over time became much, much more sophisticated. Generally, the trenches were built in several different lines, with a firing trench here up at front, no man's land in between, protected by barbed wire. You would have this sort of jagged trench to prevent, if enemy troops took it, from them to be able to fire in straight lines. And then support and reserve trenches to fill in any gaps in case the enemy gets across no man's land and is able to move into your trenches. So these were incredibly effective because machine guns and artillery caused massive damage to enemy forces as they tried to cross no man's land. Barbed wire slowed them down and made them easier targets. And then even if you got into the first line of trenches, you would have to face repeated enemy counterattacks without any further supplies or reinforcements. These trenches became almost impregnable, and so rather than try to fight through them, both sides tried to find a flank. Barbed wire was really the game changer here. Because of the effectiveness of shelling and machine guns, barbed wire, which would slow the enemy down and cause them to cut through, it was, of course, an invention that had been created in the American West in order to fence in cattle, but it turned out to be equally effective in fencing in soldiers during World War I, and so really cut down on the ability of troops to cross no man's land. Here are the accounts of crossing no man's land and trying to charge a trench. It's pretty brutal, and there's no way to really get inside the head of these soldiers without reading their accounts. So take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move forward. Shelling was also spectacularly emotionally damaging. These huge cannons would fire a couple different types of shells. You had your high explosive shells, which would blow holes in trenches and men alike. You had your shrapnel shells, which would rip apart anyone who happened to be exposed. And so the trenches, as shelling continued to commence, would become increasingly complex, increasingly fortified, and increasingly designed to protect troops from the massive destruction of the guns of World War I. Here's a description of what it was like to endure shelling, which Ernst Junger describes in his memoir, Storm of Steel. So take a moment, pause, and read. And the aftermath of this is the creation is a creation of a massive amount of psychological damage and post-traumatic, what we would call today, post-traumatic stress disorder, which then they called shell shock from soldiers who had to endure this. We also get the rise of poison gas during this time period. We'll talk in a moment about the Battle of Ypres and the use of poison gas. Poison gas was a chemical sort of byproduct of a number of industrial industrial undertakings. And there were a couple different types of poison gas, which we'll get into later. But generally, it burned out the lungs of the people breathing it in, and it was used as a weapon against soldiers, both by simply releasing it across the battlefield, and then eventually also in gas-filled shells that would be fired into trenches. Of course, countermeasures like gas masks were developed, and they were partially effective, although the race between countermeasures and offensive weapons is one of the hallmarks of the First World War. So we'll pause there, and we'll pick it up with the race to the sea and the Battle of Ypres moving forward. So for next time, we'll move over and talk about the Eastern Front and the effect of all of this on the German fight against the Russians. So next time, we'll move to the East. But for now, thank you for listening.